Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Great Leadership. My guest today, Dr. Nicholas Bloom. He is a professor of economics at Stanford and co-founder of WFH Research and WFH Map, standing for Work from Home. He's also the co-director of the Productivity, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship Program at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He's been studying working from home for 20 years, and he's arguably the #1 leading expert and researcher on all things working from home. And today we're going to be talking about a few different things. One, we're going to be going over a lot of data. So Dr. Bloom has been collecting a lot of data on this over the past few years. So we'll go and break some of that down. We'll look at how work from home has changed. We'll compare working from home versus working in the office versus hybrid, because those are three distinct areas. We'll look at productivity versus innovation when we think about these two areas. The pros and cons of working from home versus the office. We'll look at some data, as I mentioned. Perhaps we'll even get into looking at some of the balance of power that has shifted between employees and organizations. The personal goals that an individual has and how that can reflect on whether you should be in the office or working from home. And then we're going to wrap up this conversation by looking at some specific strategies that you and your organization can implement if you're considering working from home programs. So with all that said, Dr. Bloom, thank you for joining me.
Hey, Jacob, thanks very much for having me on.
So I got to say, whenever I talk about anything related to work from home, whether it's on LinkedIn or Instagram or any social channel, somebody always responds back and says, "Oh, Dr. Bloom, here's a link to this paper or this blog or something that you did." So you're clearly making the rounds. So I want to start off with something a little controversial that I put up online, and I think I sent this to you a while ago. And I put up an Instagram video, and I'll add some context to this, basically stating that I thought this concept of working from home full-time, I want to add context, that full-time was over. And I actually tell a lot of people that 2024 is going to be the year of working from the office. But I want to add context to that, not working from the office full-time, but I think 2024 is really the big year where we see a lot of organizations saying, well, you work full-time from home during the pandemic. Now we're going to get you back into the office at least some of the time, at least 3 days a week. And so when I say 2024 is the year of getting back into the office, that's kind of the context that I'm looking at it from. It's fully from home to now at least being in the office for the majority of the time. What do you think of that?
I don't disagree. So, I should say, actually, I think that's kind of been 2023. So actually, levels of work from home have flattened out. They have been dropping since the beginning of the pandemic. They've fallen by more than a half. They've now flattened. So why don't I talk about Stanford as an example, just my own organization. So we have roughly 20,000 employees. Roughly half of them have to come in every day. So they are frontline, think of food service, accommodation, transport, cleaning, a bunch of stuff. Of the other half, about 8,000 are hybrid, and they are coming in typically 3 days a week, as we talked about. The remainder of 2,000 are fully remote. So who are these folks and why do we have them? Who are they? A lot of that does more back office stuff. So think of payroll, data entry, kind of call center stuff, IT support. Why do we have them fully remote? The big reason is it's dramatically cheaper. So even if you were to say, we could look at the productivity figures and there's a big range, but imagine just you said they're 10% less efficient or less productive fully remote. If it turns out they're 30% cheaper because you don't have to pay for their office and you can hire them in Mississippi rather than in San Francisco Bay Area, then it's a good deal. So you are right. Most hybrid professionals, managers, are already back in the office. I don't disagree. There's a few outlying industries, some tech firms, but outside of even most tech is Amazon, Microsoft, Google, all the big ones are mostly back. The exception is if we look in the US, about 10% of employees are fully remote, but they tend to be, they're not professional. They're not people running organizations. They tend to be support things, or maybe coders. Journalists, weirdly enough, tend to be quite remote. Okay. I'll stop there. So I don't think I think we're pretty aligned actually, rather than disagreeing.
But so what you mentioned, I thought is very interesting, that even if you work from home, let's say hypothetically there's a 10% decline in productivity, but you're 30% cheaper, it tends to be a good deal for the business. But wouldn't that actually be a bad business strategy for the business? Because one of the things that I always tell organizations is that productivity just means you're going to go out of business later. right? I mean, a lot of what organizations are interested now isn't simply productivity, but it's innovation, it's creativity, it's growth, it's planning for the future, it's creating better leaders. So I think if you, for example, let's say you have just a lot of people in the call center or a lot of people who are in sales or kind of doing routine work, yeah, it's cheaper to have them work at home. But what about kind of this future planning for the business? And I asked that because there have been a few companies, Microsoft one, right? Satya Nadella, I think, was it last year or the year before? He said, yeah, we're more productive, but we're suffering with creativity and innovation. Another CEO, I keep butchering her last name, Sally Kraschek, I think it is, the CEO of Elevest. She said, yeah, we're saving so much money, we're being productive, but we're also getting a hit in creativity and innovation. So how do you balance that productivity piece with the growth of the business, the forward-thinking aspect of the business? Because to me, just because I can do something cheaper doesn't necessarily mean it's a good business strategy.
No, so again, I'm actually pretty aligned. So call centers, data entry, these folks tend not to be doing creative innovations. I mean, people answering, you ring up because your flight is late and you're shouting down the phone. I don't tend to shout down the phone, but you can imagine what happens in call centers. So
sure.
These folks do not tend to be that creative roles. So that's why that works well. If you're looking at people that are coming up with new ideas, creatives, managers, professionals, yes, you want to have time in the office. It looks like the sweet spot is maybe about 3 days a week. There is no exact science in this, but yeah, I just go through why that could work. So pre-pandemic, you're in the office 5 days a week. When you're in the office, a bunch of time you're doing is quiet stuff. You're doing reading emails, expense reports, preparing presentations, etc. The ideal post-pandemic office is now you come in 3 days, let's say Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. All of your meetings, presentations, team events are in those 3 days. They're kind of exhaustively social. At the end of it, you're like, I want some quiet time. But then you push the quiet time to Monday, Friday. And the evidence from the papers that I've seen and the data is if you get to that kind of cadence, that can basically give you about the same levels of innovation. But you're correct. I mean, look, I'm an academic. I write papers all the time. I ran a big conference last week. It was fully in person. So I don't disagree. It's a lot easier to do stuff in person. On the other hand, earlier today, I had 3 calls over Zoom. So I kind of like to mix it up a bit. And often new ideas may spark in person and you build them up, but then you have a bunch of ongoing calls over Zoom and you kind of combine the best of them.
Do you want to hear something really crazy? 96% of the people who watch videos on this channel are not subscribed. Help me change that number around by subscribing. Okay, so I want to dive a little bit deeper into that, but I think maybe before we dive deeper into that, why don't we take a look at some of the high-level data that you've been collecting? Because obviously, and I should point out that this is all publicly available. People can download this, people can access this, and we'll go over where people can find that. But so some of the data points that I've pulled out from your reports are roughly 28% of days are work from home. So roughly we're spending around 30% of our time working from home, 70% in the office. Most firms are 60% fully on site, 30% hybrid, and 12% fully remote. And office occupancy is around 50% now, by and large. So those are some of the high-level stats that I pulled out. But if we were to dive a little bit deeper into what's going on in the work from home space, can you give me a sense on sort of pre-pandemic versus post-pandemic? How much growth are we seeing? What have you seen in terms of productivity? The big numbers that jump out at you that I think a lot of listeners and viewers would be interested in. What would those stats be?
Sure. So I'll give you one thing is that it's a very high level characterization. So in America and Canada, Northern Europe as well, roughly half of people work in an office and roughly half don't. So who doesn't?
Is this full time or just in general?
Full time.
Okay.
If you look at that, there are roughly 200 million Americans that are working, about 100 million are in offices, about 100 million aren't. Okay. So what is non-offices? Factories, shops, hospitals, schools, etc. Non-offices tend to have pretty low levels of work from home. It's mostly office workers. If you look at office workers, they're typically working from home about half the time.
Okay.
So that's how you get to roughly a quarter of days of work from home, and why you get offices are roughly half filled. Because pre-pandemic, people were basically in offices coming in every day. Now they're roughly half time. How's that mapped out? The other big thing to have in mind, I think, is what I call the Nike swoosh. So the Nike swoosh we're kind of halfway through this thing. So work from home was dropping a lot from 2020, 21, 22. So roughly half.
So work from home, you said, was dropping during 2021. So this was during the pandemic, work from home was dropping?
Yeah, so if you think of, so you can go back in time to, if you go back to 1000 AD, so I'm going to take us back to the beginning of the pandemic. Before then, there was very little. So let's just start time at the beginning of the pandemic. This is April 2020.
Okay.
In April 2020, mass lockdown, 60% of days were work from home. Anyone that could was, even badly was doing it. It was, it was a horrible situation. Over the next 2 years, so until really the end of 2022, work from home dropped as people returned to the office. That was the big RTO movement, and it fell by just over a half. Next phase, that's the drop bit. The next bit is the flat bit, which we're right in the middle of now, which is 23, probably 24, 25, where things are stabilized. So looking at work from home data, office use data has been totally flat throughout 23. I'm pretty sure it'll be flat throughout 24, 25. The third phase is the kind of the uptick of the Nike swoosh. It's not going to be as dramatic as the Nike swoosh, but in the long run, it's going to slowly climb, just driven by better technology. So better cameras, better apps, better mics, holograms. I live out in Silicon Valley, and I see this stuff in early stage. I was at a dinner 6 months ago, and someone's describing something. They've raised several million from venture capitalists for holograms. It was like the Star Wars Jedi Council. And they're like, this is not here now. It's not even here 3 years, but they were saying 5. And so, look, if you have that, it's not like you go fully remote, but rather than coming to the office 3 days a week, you come in for 2 and have 1 Jedi Council day. What was
it like before the pandemic? So if we look at, for example, 2017, 18, 19, what percentage of people were working from home versus in the office? Can you give me a breakdown on what that looked like?
Very low. So pre-pandemic, it was 5% of days. The best number is really days. So as you said earlier, we're now roughly 25, 30% now. So there's been a 5 to 6 fold increase. Jeez. Another way to think of that is that's about 50 years of pre-pandemic growth. I mean, literally, we would not, if it hadn't been for the pandemic, we may well have not had this level of work from home that we're seeing now until like 2070 or something, if you extrapolated.
That's crazy.
So if you look at any figure, what you see is an enormous jump up to, you see a level from almost zero to an enormous jump up early in the pandemic, then it falls by about a half, and then it's flat.
Okay. And what does your data show in terms of productivity? Because this comes up a lot in conversations, right? And there's this ongoing debate, which, we can talk about kind of the different sides there. There's the productivity side. There's the innovation and growth side, which we touched on earlier. And there's also a lot of stats that are coming out around mental health and well-being. Now, I'm less, how should I say, less supportive of those stats, because I don't think that a lot of loneliness or a lot of the negative aspects of working from home can be purely attributed to the organization. I think there's a lot that goes into how you manage and lead your own life and what happens outside of work, and if you have a community and if you have friends and a social circle. So I agree that working from home all the time can contribute to that, but I don't think it's fair to put all of that blame on the organization, saying, well, because I work from home, therefore I am lonely, therefore I am struggling with mental health. I think we're all, responsible adults, and we have more control and agency over how we live our lives. So I don't think it's entirely fair to put the blame fully on the company. But why don't we start with productivity first? What does your data show in terms of being productive in the office versus from home?
Sure. So here it's really critical, as we talked about earlier, to separate hybrid from fully remote.
Yeah.
So let's just start with hybrid. So hybrid, it's about flat. So, hybrid based, classically we're thinking in the office Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, work from home Monday, Friday.
For 3 days in the office, 2 days from home.
Yeah, something like that. Okay. That's vanilla. Like vanilla ice cream is the most popular flavor. Probably only 20% of people eat it, but it's like hybrid 3 days into it. So why is that flat? Well, there's obviously negatives. You're just less in the office. Offices are good for mentoring. They're good for, sharing ideas, for building culture. So that's obviously negative on it. The positives on a hybrid are that, one, there's less commuting. Average person saves about an hour a day. Some of that time they actually work, some of that they sleep more. The other is there's evidence of what's called the benefits of quiet time at home and what's called bursting. So actually it looks like innovation's kind of maximized if you have some time together and some time to reflect. Net of all of that in the studies is hybrid is about zero. It's neither better nor worse. And I've looked at, I could bore you endlessly about various papers on this, but roughly, I don't think it's a huge surprise that having 2 days a week work from home is on net zero.
Okay, so hybrid, so just to recap, hybrid productivity is flat. It doesn't matter whether you're in the office full time or you're hybrid, your productivity is around the same.
Yeah, conditional on this being properly organized. So pretty big caveat here is that when folks come in, they come in on the same day. Bad hybrid is like, I'm in Monday, Tuesday, you're in Wednesday, Thursday, Friday.
You missed each other and yeah.
Yeah, so I would say what I call organized, well-managed hybrid is about flat.
Okay.
Then on fully remote, there's an enormous range of estimates in the literature from minus 30% to plus 13.
Wow.
The mean is maybe minus 10. Why is the spread so big? It depends. It's really sensitive to how well you manage it. So you're going to get minus 30, maybe even minus 40, 50 if it's badly managed. It's like early in the lockdown. It was done at speed, chaotic, no systems, no training. That is just disastrous. And that is very costly. At the other extreme, you can get maybe 0 to positive numbers if you're like GitHub and you're dealing with a bunch of 30, 40 somethings that are already trained, that are very efficient. You've been doing this for 10 years and you're a ninja at fully remote. I would say for a typical firm out there that is not GitHub, you may be looking at minus 10%. You then would ask, I get asked a lot, then why on earth would anyone do it? Coming back to the discussion earlier, the reason you do it is even if you're minus 10% in productivity, for certain roles, you may find you're minus 30% on costs. So it's really like, again, coming back to many organizations, it's not that most people are remote. It's that, HR, payroll, data entry, these kind of roles become remote.
Okay, so let me just recap because I think this is really interesting for people to know. And what about fully in the office? I mean, is that, I guess it's hard to say you're more, because that's the baseline, right? So...
Yeah, the reason fully in the office is kind of died. So just to give you another number, very few people are now fully in the office amongst managers and professionals is they don't really like it. So the numbers we get is something like, people basically, I've done surveys, tens of thousands of Americans, they say they value being able to work hybrid about the same as an 8% pay increase. Look, you're a firm and you say this thing, it has no effect on productivity, but my employees really like it. Why don't you just do it? Because it just, makes it easier to retain and recruit. So hybrid is so dominant, not because of productivity. It's because it's dominant because basically it's retention and recruitment.
So how would you compare, I guess, work from home versus hybrid? So we talked about productivity in terms of hybrid and full-time work from home. Where does productivity in the office full-time fit into that? Are people more productive if they are in the office full-time versus if they're hybrid, or if they are...
On average, no. Versus full-time in the office versus fully remote, on average productivity looks higher. Full-time in the office versus hybrid, it looks about flat.
Okay. All right, so let me just quickly recap that so people can get a sense of the comparisons. So if you are full-time in the office, you have around the same level of productivity as you do if you are hybrid. I guess the difference is if your hybrid employees like it more, your costs go down a little bit. And the difference between hybrid versus fully remote is that if you're remote, you can expect roughly high level, a 10% decrease in productivity, but you might save 10, 15, 20, 30% in terms of costs. So purely looking at the dollars and cents there, the work from home full-time there might make sense. Does that about sound right?
No, it's part, an important additional point is exactly what you said earlier. This is static. The reason that you don't want to have fully remote for every role is there's also a dynamic, which is long run productivity growth. Now, in roles where that's not a big deal, think call centers, you don't really have to worry about that. In roles where it is, like, my job, I teach and do research, and that's just not nearly as good remote. And, my productivity.
Exactly. So that's what I kind of wanted to go to next is sort of the context here, because I think a lot of people get very hung up on work from home versus work in the office versus hybrid, but they forget that the role that you're in and the context matters. And so obviously, if you are in a call center and your job every single day is just to make phone calls, to answer phone calls, yeah, you probably don't need to step foot into an office. But if you are in marketing or in sales maybe, or in your operations or research and development, the context of the role there makes a difference. Did you collect data on the different types of roles and kind of put that over the different types of work styles? Or what do you recommend there?
I mean, that is a great summary. Look, the study I did that showed a plus 13% of work from home productivity impact was in a call center in an extremely well-run firm that's NASDAQ listed. It's a kick-ass multinational. It's called Trip.com. And if anyone's visited call centers, nobody's managing by watching what people do anyway.
Yeah.
If you're a manager of a team of 15 people in a call center, you're looking at the numbers as it is. You're looking at calls, processes, wait times, quality metrics. So it doesn't really matter whether they're sitting next to you or not. So in that study, sure, you can get big productivity increases. Interestingly, there was a downside, which is in that study, promotion rates were significantly lower for people working from home.
Yes.
So already you're looking at the short and long run. So what's going on is day to day, you're more productive at home because you're cutting out all the gap breaks and, chatter time with your friends, etc. But there is some longer run cost. So often there's a short run, long run trade-off. Basically, when I talk to big firms, there is no one size fits all. Typically, large firms have some people that need to come in every day because they're working on customers' equipment, machinery. Some managers, professionals that are creatives, mentoring, training, they're typically hybrid. And some people they're executing on very specific tasks that may, for cost reasons, be fully remote.
Okay. So then can we agree that 2024 is going to be the year of the return to the office in some capacity? I guess maybe we can even call it the emergence of hybrid, where a lot of employees, I think, are, to your point, going to be 3 days in the office, 2 days from home. Because when I say that, everybody says, no, Dr. Bloom says everyone's going to be working from home forever and you don't need the office anymore.
I think it's stabilized. The office sector's suffering, but it's totally not dead.
Yeah.
So in fact, high quality, big offices and city centers are doing just fine. Why? Because if you're hybrid, you need people in 3 days a week. You want somewhere nice to go. What's kind of suffering is, I don't know, this is a British word, but grungy, nasty, dingy, offices. If you're hybrid, it's not very appealing to drag somebody in 3 days a week for some, nasty office on some suburban industrial park. Like people are like, this is not what I think of as hybrid.
Yeah,
so that's
exactly
where the market is suffering.
Okay.
But the office sector is down. It's definitely not out. It's been tough. The problem with the office sector is even small variations in demand lead to big variations in price. Because what else can you do with it, right? 20% drop in demand for office space, that kills the price of offices.
Yeah.
But it's going to recover. This is a sector, 5 years of, less building, a bit of reconversions, and we'll eventually reconfigure demand and supply.
Now, the other thing I wanted to touch on is, so we talked about this kind of from the company side, but one of the things that I always talk about is also from the side of the employee as an individual. And kind of the advice that I give to a lot of people is that if you have aspirations in your career of getting into leadership, of leading a team, of leading a function, a business, maybe even one day becoming the CEO of a company, you should spend more time in the office. You should spend, and it's not like I'm saying there's a correlation between if you spend more time, you're going to get promoted, but I mean strategically spending more time in the office, around your leaders where you can get coached and mentored in person, around your peers, around people who can see you work, because that's where you're going to learn things like executive presence and communication and negotiation and how to solve problems. That's where you're going to be able to grab coffee with your leader, right? There's a lot of that goes into your personal career success. And I think there's a very unique opportunity for people, right? In a world where so many just want to stay from home, if you're going to be that person that says, you know what, I do have aspirations of doing something greater and becoming a leader, while everybody's staying from home, I'm going to take advantage of that and be in front of my leaders more often. I think if you're okay with where you are and you're just kind of checking things off a to-do list, by all means, never show up to the office. But to your point, the people who worked from home suffered in terms of promotion, which makes sense, right? Because if the leaders see you have all those different types of interactions, I think you're going to do better. What do you think of the kind of the relationship between in the office versus promotion in your leadership development?
So again, I think we're pretty aligned. So, yesterday night, I was actually talking to my oldest daughter who's 20 about a summer internship, and, one of them is fully remote. And I was like, I probably wouldn't do that. Fully remote is going to be really hard. When I talk to Stanford undergrads for their first jobs, think about in your 20s, you probably want to be coming in, not 5. I mean, you can work from home on Fridays, but say 3, maybe 4. I'm totally on board. What you see in the data is people in their 20s actually tend to want to come in the office for exactly this mentoring and learning reason. By the time you get to your 30s and 40s, it's not like you want to be fully remote, but you maybe reduce it by a day a week, and you tend to have young kids and you live further away. Interestingly, for organizations, the bigger struggle is actually not the young folks, it's the middle and senior managers doing the mentoring. So the classic issue is, I talk to the CEO. CEOs are, tend to be quite office-focused people because they're super successful. They work like demons. They're highly smart. They're also often got millions, tens of millions in their companies. So you don't need to persuade them to come in 5 days a week. And one of them said to me, it's amazing when I'm in the office, all my jokes are very funny. And it's like, yeah, well, you're the CEO. So CEOs want to come in. The problem is the next level down, the next couple of levels down. These are middle senior managers who are doing really well. Think of them, they're in their 40s, maybe 50s, maybe late 30s. They're very experienced. They have great relationships with clients, with product. They don't need to be in. They're like, I got my kids. I don't really want to come in 3-4 days a week. The problem is they're the ones doing the mentoring. So often the struggle for companies, oddly enough, is that middle group that they want to get in for 3 days a week to train the newbies. I was talking to a law firm. It's a perfect example of this. The head partner was, tearing the hair out about how to get, the next level down, the partners and almost partners in. They were saying, hey, these folks, they're dealing with their clients. They're happy at home. I need them in. I need them to be training the associates. I don't need them in 5 days a week, but I really need them to come in 3. And by the way, for businesses, I think the solution is not swipe card monitoring, because that just pisses people off. It's actually evaluating and having performance reviews, including a component on building talent. So, Jacob, if you're my boss and you say, Nick, I'm going to evaluate you, 25% of your performance review and bonus is going to be based on how well you mentor and train people below you, you bet I'm going to be coming in 3 days a week.
Yeah.
If instead you say, I'm going to measure your swipe cards, I'm going to be complaining behind your back and saying this is ridiculous. Because the swipe card's like the intermediate thing. You ultimately care about the mentoring and training. So why not just pay for that?
Great news. My brand new book, Leading with Vulnerability, is now officially out, and I'm so excited to share the insights from the 100 CEOs and the 14,000 employees around the world that I surveyed. And the whole book explores why you should not be vulnerable at work, but why instead you should lead with vulnerability. In other words, don't just focus on exposing your gaps, but also talk about what you are doing to close those gaps. That's the difference between being vulnerable and leading with vulnerability. If you want to learn more and grab a copy, head over to leadwithvulnerability.com. Again, that is leadwithvulnerability.com. Do you think it's interesting that, and this is one of the things that boggles my mind, right? I mean, the relationship between an employee and employer is, as an employee, you sort of commit to the organization that you have a certain set of skills, that you can do a job, and the company basically hires you, they pay you, benefits, all that sort of stuff. To me, it just seems crazy that we have to now convince employees to show up to an office, right? I mean, it's almost mind-boggling that I, as an employer, where I'm paying your salary, I'm paying your benefits, I'm taking care of your 401k, I'm paying for this office, I'm paying for your computer, I'm paying for all these things for you to be able to work. You are now telling me, I'm good, I'm going to stay from home. Why aren't companies out there just saying, I don't care what you want, like, come back to the office? Because there are articles that are being put out of, all these crazy perks that companies are trying to implement to lure employees back to the office. And that to me is like, what are you talking about? You lure employees to the office. They work for you. Tell them to come into work. What are you seeing, like, when you have these conversations with executives and leaders? Does this just not sound insane to you? Like, if we were to have this conversation 5 years ago, where somebody were to say, hey, what are you doing to convince your employees to work in the office? I'd say, what are you talking about?
No. I have the same thought. Look, I'm 50. I've been working. Look, I started my career in 1994, and I worked in McKinsey in the Treasury. I mean, I've had a lot of different jobs.
Imagine if you told McKinsey, you're like, you know what? I'm good working from home. And they're like, please, Dr. Bloom, what can we do to get you to come back to the office?
I assure you, trying to tell McKinsey you're only working 5 days a week was impossible.
Yeah, they'd be like, you're gone. See you later.
Yeah, you're right. So, in fact, when I signed my contract in London, I think I started there in 1996, in the envelope that came from McKinsey, there were 2 things to sign. One was my contract, and one was the opt-out of the working time directive that was the regulation to limit me to 40 hours a week. And it was like, good luck, anyone
Very
trying
smart, very smart.
Yeah, they said the aspiration was 80 hours a week. I mean, so anyway, back to this.
Wait, they told you the aspiration was 80 hours a week?
Yeah, they said 60 to 80 is the
Wow.
aspiration.
Oh, you can't say that today. You can't say that today. People are going to come for your head if you tell people that today.
So one thing is tight labor markets have shifted power a bit, and if we go into recession, this may shift back. The other thing is this is overblown, I think, in terms of this dispute. So just again, put numbers on it. When we survey Americans, the average employee says they want to work from home, I think, 2 3/4 days a week. This is professionals and managers, people listening, think graduates really. They are typically getting 2 1/4. So you're only seeing a half a day deviation. So the gap is not that big. Why you see lots of complaining is individuals have strong preferences. So sure, on average, they want 2 3/4, but about a third of them want to be fully remote, and some of them happen to be trapped or currently in firms aren't offering it. So it's one of those things that a few loud voices make a big difference. So take Apple. 1,000 people signed that petition in Apple.
Can you give context on the petition? Because some people might not know what you're talking about.
Oh, yeah. So about a year and a half ago, 1,000 people signed a petition bitterly complaining that Apple was requiring employees to come back to the office 3 days a week. So I actually flipped it around thinking I was amazed only 1,000 signed it. We know from our data across the US, 20% of people actually want to come in every day, 50% want hybrid, and 30% want to be fully remote. So take the 30% that want to be fully remote. Apple has 150,000 employees. 30% of that is 45,000 people. So my guess is there are about 45,000 people at Apple that would love to be fully remote. The issue is there's 105,000 that want to come in at least 1 day a week. So what Tim Cook did, I think, is pretty reasonable if you're going to have one size fits all. You could debate and say, look, maybe you have some remote teams, some hybrid teams, some in person. His view at that time was just going to have one role, one setup for all managers and professionals. My advice to employees, if you really want to be fully remote, is either find a different role in the same organization or maybe change jobs. Now, labor markets are still pretty good. It's a bit like, the weird thing is what happened is we all had the same setup in 2019. Everyone basically came in every day. Suddenly, this new thing called remote work happens, which I'm a big fan of. I mean, I like it. I work from home 3 days a week, but it varies a lot. And it's kind of like, if you want to live in New York, don't work for a firm that's operating in Cleveland. Quit that firm and go work for a firm that's operating in New York. If you want to be fully remote, there are many fully remote jobs. It just may not be your current employer post-pandemic. And so that's why the Great Resignation happened. There are a lot of people that discovered they were just a mismatch for their employer and moved. And over time, that's settling down. The one piece of advice for employees that makes me slightly nervous of going to fully remote jobs actually in the US right now is the combination of AI and offshoring.
Yep.
Those two in the near term aren't a big threat, but particularly if you're doing a very repetitive job, think call center, which I doubt many of your listeners are, but if you think of call centers, data entry, that might be a fully remote job in the US now. 5 or 10 years, it's less obvious. If that's not done by AI, it won't be done, by someone in Mexico, Brazil, Philippines, etc.
But it's also, if you're working from home full time all the time, part of me wonders, right? I mean, when the labor market expands a little bit and we have more of a talent pool during the pandemic, a lot of employees, because the labor market was so tight, they were asking for more money, more equity. They were, they were kind of, it was a land grab, so to speak, to take as much as you can for whatever company is going to hire you. And so part of me wonders when talent becomes a little bit more plentiful in the coming years, if it does, and when companies go through layoffs like we're starting to see, the first people that they're going to lay off are going to be those people who asked for more money, who wanted more from the business, yet who are not willing to show up. So to me, it's sort of in your best interest, especially in this present climate, to not kind of rock the boat too much, right? I mean, it depends on what your personal goals and aspirations are, but I would hope and imagine that a lot of people do want to progress in their roles. And I've never met a senior executive or a CEO or any senior leader at any company who's ever gotten to where they are by never stepping foot into the office. So part of me wonders if we're going to be hurting ourselves as an employee, as an individual, by demanding and asking to be working from home full time. I mean, how can you possibly get promoted into a leadership role where you're responsible for motivating and engaging and inspiring others when all you do is stare at a screen? How are you going to learn leadership development? How are you going to learn all these things if you don't have that physical presence?
So I'd have a more nuanced take on that. It depends what the alternative is. So on the layoffs, I think it depends on how much you cost. If it turns out, look, if I'm a manager and there's a work from home group and they cost because there's no offices and they're on Mississippi pay versus California pay, I need to compare costs and benefits. So I think in terms of career, it depends what the alternative is. Look, for my kids and my undergrads, I generally advise them to go hybrid.
Yeah.
If, for example, you're in some really rural area and you have a spouse and you can't move, or you're, looking after young kids, or you're living in, in Mexico and you can't access US labor markets, and maybe fully remote is your best bet. You're right. Your rate of learning is probably lower and it is very hard to learn management skills. But it may be, look, I have young kids. I decide I'm not going to go in every day. I do fully remote for 3 years. If you think of, my mum did some remote work for a bit. And then, once I'm one of 4 kids and both my parents worked. For a period, she was remote. In the end, at least she stayed in the labor market. You're right. It was not as progressive.
Yeah.
So I think if you're a 20-something, you're able-bodied, you can go in every day. I'd probably advise going 3-4 days a week.
And
yeah, depends what the alternative is, I think.
Yeah, and for some people it makes sense because my dad is an aerospace engineer, and prior to the pandemic, he was going into the office 5 days a week. Now, he at the time was in his late 60s, early 70s. Now he's in his early 70s. And so for him, I could easily make the argument, yeah, you're about to retire. Work from home full time, that's great, right? You're not going to get promoted at this rate into like a senior executive at the company. And so I do think the context there matters for sure.
By the way, that's a really good point. And some of the bigger societal benefits is folks like that, particularly for, I think of my parents in their 80s now, they're both kind of retired out, but think of them towards the end of their career. Actually, Americans with a disability, there's about 20 million of them.
Yeah.
These are groups who are much more likely to work if they're allowed to work from home at least some time. For everyone else, that's an enormous benefit. These folks, by working, they pay taxes, they keep tax bills down, they provide goods and services, they keep prices down, reduce inflation. So weirdly enough, even if you don't work from home at all, you indirectly benefit because your tax bill ultimately is lower and the prices you pay are a little bit lower because of this.
Yeah, for some people, it's a question of I'm in the labor market and I have a job or I don't. So how do you reconcile, right? I think there's a big difference between data and application of data, right? For example, you can tell somebody why they should eat healthy. You could tell somebody why they should stop smoking. Yet a lot of people still smoke and a lot of people will eat McDonald's every day. So how do you reconcile, right, the data side of it with, because there are a lot of Elon Musk, a good example, right? I think the CEO of Goldman Sachs, what with the CEO of Netflix, and there were a lot of other executives out there who were kind of saying, we want you back into the office, if not full-time, most of the time. And you might share that data with them and they'll say, I don't care what Dr. Bloom says. Like, I know, I can see my people working. I know what's going on. Because it's one thing, obviously, again, look at data and to put things into practice. So for a lot of executives, for a lot of employees out there, they're looking at the data. How do you have that negotiation between data versus actually taking action on that data?
So I don't think, again, it's this disagreement is really more of a media fabrication than what happens in large scale. So something like 90% of managers and professionals are hybrid. I spoke to David Solomon at Goldman Sachs.
Oh, okay.
And, he was complaining that the media portrays him as, it's a kind of Bollywoodization of CEOs. They're either all bad or all good. And, the media portrays him. So he said, look, we have a lot of mentoring. That's important. I get that. And that's best in person. He said, we are mostly in person, but a bit less than pre-pandemic. They've moved in the same direction as the rest of society. Jamie Dimon, I heard him interviewed the other day on The Economist, has this blog. And he said, look, of our professionals, I think a third are coming in every day. The other 2/3 aren't. They're hybrid. Elon Musk, he's fantastically wealthy. I think he's one of the world's wealthiest individuals. Very successful, but he's not been perfect. If you look at Twitter, it's been a disaster recently under Musk. It's hard to know when he speaks about work from home what he really means, because at Twitter, he required full in-office attendance early on. Turned out it was impossible because so many people quit, so he backtracked. I think some of his musings are frustrations rather than policy. And the frustrations comes from the fact that, in reality, we know employees like to be hybrid. So look, if you're not getting an 8% extra productivity by forcing them in 5 days a week, why do it? It just pisses them off. It's kind of like You could set the air conditioning to super cold in the office. It would really upset your employees. What's the point? If it doesn't improve productivity, why would you do it? Most people don't tend to do that. So generally, unless something makes the firm perform better, if it upsets the employees, don't bother. And that's why I don't think it's so controversial. Fully remote is. I totally see fully remote is a very different thing. But most of the debate really is on fully remote rather than hybrid.
So, and it sounds like you don't necessarily advocate for fully remote. You're kind of on the hybrid camp. I mean, I'm definitely on that hybrid camp. I'm a big believer.
I'm advocating for, it depends on the role. Okay. It really does depend on the role. I'm an advisor to, and which means I have small equity, and I, made some angel investments to 6 startups. Some of them are, larger than startups now. They have a mix, and I'm totally in favor of that, as with Stanford. Look, if it's a call center, I'll give you another anecdote. It's a great example. I was speaking at an event to a bunch of restaurant owners, and one of them came up to me afterwards. He runs a big chain of taco shops in Los Angeles. And he said, look, all my employees need to go in every day. Everything's in person. But my accounting whole team, I'm going to move them to Mexico. He said, I reckon they'll be 80% as efficient in Mexico, but they're going to cost me 40%. So I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
And that was like a perfect example. There's no innovation coming from a taco chain's accounting group. There's probably not much mentoring. I mean, he's hiring trained accountants.
Yeah.
It seems like right decision. On the other hand, if he thought about, the food R&D lab, probably not, because you want those people working together, tasting stuff, kicking ideas around, et cetera, over lunch.
Okay. So one more question for you before we go into kind of the strategic aspect on, advice that you might have for leaders and companies out there. Looking forward, so looking at 2024 and even beyond 2024, what do you think is going to be the future of work in terms of hybrid versus work from home versus in the office? What are you seeing as far as the data goes?
So hybrid, I think, is almost certainly going to grow. Why? Because technology is just going to make it easier to work remotely. Again, to be clear, that I'm thinking of, 1-2 days a week rather than fully remote. Yeah. So hybrid will grow. There's some jobs that are fully in person right now that will slowly drift into hybrid. So one great example is doctors. So pre-pandemic, doctors went in every day. During the pandemic, they changed the regulations on health insurance and actually over HIPAA information allowed them to do telemedicine. And that's now kind of stuck. Next group, fully in person, will probably shrink a little bit. There are some roles that are going from fully in person, oddly, to hybrid or remote. So the best example I know is when you go through a drive-by for a burger restaurant, when you shout into that speaker to put your order, that person used to be sitting in that little cabin that you get your food from, 20 feet down the road. Now, for the bigger chains, they've centralized them and they're at home because it's way cheaper. You don't actually need the person punching the order that you speak into the computer to be there. And so the final group that's hardest to talk about is fully remote. Here, things for me are a bit uncertain. On the one hand, you think technology makes it easier to make stuff remote. I just gave you an example of a burger chain. On the other hand, AI and offshoring may mean those jobs don't show up in America. So take that burger chain order shouting thing. In 5 years' time, it will probably be AI. You're shouting to the thing and it'll be some computer voice that's connected to the computer. Yeah. So I see hybrid growing, fully in person shrinking, and probably fully remote remaining a bit roughly stable.
Okay, let's jump into what I call the Leaders Toolkit section of the interview, where we talk about how to put some of these things into practice. So what would be the best practices here? And I guess maybe we could start high level. So somebody who's listening to this or watching this thinking, okay, I get what my 3 options are: in-person, full-time, hybrid work, or fully working from home. So starting there, if I'm a leader of a company, how do I decide who goes where, what mix I have of each? My conversation with Dr. Bloom continues as we talk about how to put these hybrid work policies into place. We're going to be going over the strategic elements of how to make hybrid work a reality. We're going to start the conversation by looking at the difference between work from home versus fully remote versus hybrid work, and how you should decide where people should go into each one of those categories. Granted that the standard for 2024 and beyond is likely going to be hybrid work, we spend the rest of our Leaders Toolkit section talking about how to make hybrid work a reality. Early in the conversation, Dr. Bloom talked about organized hybrid work and kind of the right way and the wrong way to approach it. So in this Leaders Toolkit bonus episode, we're going to talk about the right way to approach it. He's going to give some strategies that you can implement inside of your organization as well. Now, this episode is only going to be available to subscribers of Great Leadership Plus on Apple Podcasts. So make sure that you sign up over there. I also encourage you to join our Substack community of around 40,000 leaders from around the world. And if you want to get a 20% discount to that just for being a listener to this show, head to greatleadership.substack.com/GL podcast. Now, while we're working on a shorter URL, if you forget that for whatever reason, just email me, jacob@thefutureorganization.com, and I will take care of the rest for you. And last but not least, behold this amazing, wonderfully designed book called Leading with Vulnerability, which is available for your reading pleasure. You can grab a copy at leadwithvulnerability.com. Thanks for tuning in. And if you have somebody in your life who you would like to see become a better leader, please send them this show. And I will see you next time.